The world of 1945 is often portrayed as a clean break between war and peace, as if one of the most violent chapters in human history came to a sudden, decisive end the moment the Axis power surrendered. But the truth is far more complicated and far more revealing. 1945 was not an ending. It was a pivot point, a global turning of gears that reshaped borders, alliances, identities, and entire civilizations in ways most people never saw and in many cases were never meant to see. Beneath the rubble of bombed-out cities, beneath the celebrations and photographs of soldiers returning home, beneath the new institutions and treaties meant to guarantee peace, an invisible world was forming. A world of secret deals, improvised power structures, desperate maneuvering, and quiet continuity with the darker forces of the war itself. The result was not simply a transition from war to peace. It was a birth of the modern world as we know it, with all its contradictions, tensions, and unresolved wounds. In the immediate aftermath of the war, every nation was exhausted, traumatized, and scrambling for survival or dominance. The victorious powers claimed unity, but each had different goals. The United States saw an opportunity to shape a world order that aligned with its economic and political ideals. The Soviet Union, having lost more than 20 million of its citizens, sought security above all else, pushing its borders westward through influence and force. Britain and France wanted desperately to maintain the illusion of imperial strength despite being financially broken. And China, still in the middle of its own civil war, struggled to define itself amid internal collapse and external pressure. The end of the war did not place the world on a stable foundation. Instead, it revealed a landscape where everything was up for grabs. Ideological futures, territorial claims, coalitions, intelligence networks, and scientific knowledge. Decisions made in the weeks and months after 1945 continue to ripple outward today, shaping conflicts from Eastern Europe to the Middle East, from East Asia to Africa, and shaping the global institutions that still determine how power is negotiated. One of the most misunderstood aspects of 1945 is how much of the old order survived beneath the surface. Many governments were toppled, but bureaucracies, corporate networks, scientific institutions, and intelligence agencies remained largely intact, and they quickly adapted to the new world. Former enemies became convenient collaborators, former allies became rivals, and lines that once seemed clearly drawn in blood began to blur. The moral clarity of wartime dissolved almost immediately into a new kind of pragmatism, one in which information, expertise, and influence mattered more than ideology. This shift allowed individuals and organizations involved in wartime atrocities to reinvent themselves as assets in the new struggle taking shape, the struggle for global power between East and West. Scientists who once worked on weapons of destruction found themselves courted by both the United States and the Soviet Union. Industrialists who profited from forced labor saw their companies reabsorbed into the post-war economy with minimal punishment. Intelligence officers who once acted in service of dictatorships suddenly found themselves providing insight to democratic governments eager for an advantage. The world that emerged from 1945 was not built solely by heroes and visionaries. It was shaped equally by opportunists, former collaborators, and hidden power brokers who understood the value of what they knew. Another hidden transformation of 1945 lay in the way borders and populations were moved without global scrutiny. As nations redrew their maps, millions of people were uprooted in what became one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe in waves of violence that left entire communities erased. Jews who survived the Holocaust often had no homes to return to, and many were placed in displaced persons camps that eerily resembled the camps they had just been liberated from. Eastern Europeans fleeing the advance of the Soviet forces sought asylum in the West, often finding themselves caught between governments that viewed them as political pawns rather than human beings. And in Asia, Japanese civilians and soldiers were stranded in foreign territories, from China to Indonesia, often facing retribution from populations enraged by years of occupation. These population movements were not merely humanitarian tragedies. They were strategic calculations made by governments to reshape ethnic and political landscapes in ways that would favor their long-term goals. Many of today's geopolitical tensions and ethnic disputes can be traced directly back to the demographic engineering and disorder of those immediate post-war years. One of the most consequential but least visible shifts of 1945 involved the transfer of intelligence networks and covert power structures that have been built during the war. Nazi intelligence officers, Japanese military researchers, Soviet spies embedded in the West, and Allied operatives who had developed clandestine networks across Europe and Asia all found their roles evolving rather than ending. For many governments, information became the most valuable currency in the New World, especially as tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union began to harden. Former enemies were judged not by their past crimes, but by their potential usefulness. This led to secret bargains that the public would not learn about for decades, war criminals being quietly protected, scientists relocated in secrecy, and covert operations launched long before the Cold War was publicly acknowledged. It was in these hidden exchanges that the architecture of modern intelligence communities was built. The world of espionage, disinformation, and covert intervention did not begin during the Cold War. It began in the chaotic vacuum immediately following 1945. At the same time, an entirely new global framework was forming through institutions meant to promote cooperation and peace. The United Nations was created not just as a moral project, but as a mechanism for stabilizing power relations between the major victors and managing conflict among smaller states. But even this institution was shaped by hidden compromises and backstage negotiations. Decisions about veto power, territorial trusteeships, and the structure of the Security Council reflected geopolitical realities rather than idealistic visions. The UN became less a parliament of humanity and more a stage on which the great powers could legitimize their interests. Many of the global crises that the UN struggles with today, from stalled resolutions to peacekeeping limits, are rooted in decisions made in 1945, when the victors prioritized control over equality. This early concentration of authority set the boundaries of international law and diplomacy in ways that still constrain global governance. Another secret transformation occurred in the world economy. While Europe lay in ruins, the United States emerged not just victorious, but economically dominant. American factories were untouched, its infrastructure was intact, and its industrial output had soared during wartime mobilization. This gave the United States enormous influence in shaping the global financial order. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, conceived at Bretton Woods, became instruments through which the United States could stabilize allies, weaken potential rivals, and encourage economic systems compatible with American interests. But beneath their public missions of reconstruction and development, these institutions also served strategic purposes. Loans came with political expectations. Economic assistance influenced elections, trade policy, and military alignment. The dollar quietly became the backbone of global commerce, giving the United States a degree of leverage that no empire in history had possessed. While Europe and Asia rebuilt, the foundations of a new global economic hierarchy were already being laid, and the consequences of those early choices still define global inequality and financial dependence. Meanwhile, colonial empires were collapsing in slow motion. The war had weakened European powers, emboldened nationalist movements, and exposed the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom abroad while denying it to millions at home. But decolonization did not unfold in a straight line. Many European governments attempted to reassert control, leading to violent conflicts in places like Indonesia, Algeria, Vietnam, and Kenya. The hidden story of 1945 is not just liberation. It is the beginning of a series of brutal struggles in which old empires tried desperately to reclaim what they had lost. The United States and the Soviet Union exploited these struggles, each seeing newly independent nations as battlegrounds in their emerging rivalry. Promises of aid, ideology, and military support masked deeper ambitions. The result was a series of proxy conflicts, covert coups, and political manipulations that shaped the map of the developing world. The seeds of many modern regional conflicts were planted in the moment when colonial empires crumbled and new states were thrust into a global contest for influence. Even the cultural and psychological aftermath of 1945 carried hidden consequences. Societies traumatized by war sought stability, but the methods they chose varied dramatically. Some nations attempted to erase painful memories, pushing narratives of heroism and unity, while suppressing stories of collaboration, resistance, or internal division. Others embarked on complex processes of reconstruction, purging former fascists or collaborators, though often inconsistently. The politics of memory became intertwined with the politics of power. How countries told the story of the war became a tool for shaping national identity, justifying policy, or legitimizing leadership. These early post-war narratives hardened over time, influencing education systems, foreign relations, and public attitudes. The way nations remember or misremember 1945 continues to affect international tensions, particularly in East Asia and Eastern Europe, where wartime history remains a political battleground. All these developments took place behind the scenes, often invisible to ordinary people who simply wanted to rebuild their lives. Yet those hidden decisions, forged in back rooms, diplomatic halls, and intelligence offices, determined the shape of the modern world. The aftermath of 1945 was not a linear march to peace. It was a chaotic, morally ambiguous struggle for advantage among old powers, new powers, collapsing empires, emerging states, and individuals who understood that crisis creates opportunity. The borders, institutions, alliances, and conflicts that define our world today trace their origins to that turbulent moment. To understand modern geopolitics, one must return to the shadows of 1945, not to the headlines, but to the quiet choices that were never meant to be seen. The world that emerged after 1945 was not only shaped by treaties and governments, it was shaped by the silent race to capture the future. Beneath the public declarations of peace and reconstruction, the major powers were already moving to secure the technologies, resources, and knowledge that would define the next century. The end of the war created a vacuum in which the boundaries between science, espionage, and politics collapsed almost overnight. Laboratories that had once served the war machines of fascist Europe and Imperial Japan suddenly became coveted assets in a new struggle that had barely begun but would soon dominate global affairs: the Cold War. The winning side would not simply be the nation with the biggest army or the largest industrial base. It would be the side that controlled the smartest minds, the most advanced weapons, the deepest intelligence networks, and the most effective propaganda. And so, as cities smoldered and refugees wandered the ruins, a quiet competition began, one that would reshape the very idea of global power. One of the most striking examples of this transition was Operation Paperclip, the secret American effort to recruit German scientists, engineers, and technicians who had worked on advanced weapons programs. Many of these men had belonged to the Nazi Party, some had overseen forced labor, and others had been involved in experiments that bordered on war crimes. Yet the United States, confronting the reality that the Soviet Union was rapidly expanding its influence, chose to look past these moral complications. The logic was brutally simple. If the United States did not capture these experts, the Soviets would. This pragmatic decision marked the turning point in which the moral certainties of wartime gave way to the strategic ambiguities of the Cold War. Men who had once built weapons for Hitler soon found themselves developing rockets for NASA, advising the Pentagon, or shaping American research institutions. Their past was scrubbed from public record, their contributions reframed as heroic, and their knowledge became the foundation of America's technological dominance, from ballistic missiles to the space race. The world remembered the triumph of landing on the moon, but few remember that the roots of that achievement were planted in the ashes of 1945, amid decisions made in secrecy and justified by fear. The Soviet Union, for its part, was conducting similar operations, though with far less subtlety. Soviet intelligence agencies seized German laboratories, dismantled factories, and forcibly relocated entire teams of specialists to the USSR. Many of these scientists had no choice but to contribute to Soviet advances in rocketry, chemistry, and nuclear physics. The Soviets understood that knowledge was power, and in the new world emerging from the war, scientific expertise mattered as much as territory. They also inherited networks of spies and informants that had infiltrated Western institutions for years. In the early post-war period, Soviet intelligence achieved some of its greatest successes, not through military conquests, but through the strategic use of information, leveraging both captured scientists and their espionage networks. This access to secret research accelerated the Soviet nuclear program and narrowed the technological gap between East and West much faster than Western leaders had anticipated. The Cold War's arms race, often portrayed as a contest of ideology or willpower, was in many ways a contest born directly from the spoils of 1945. While the struggle for scientific dominance unfolded, another hidden shift was transforming the global landscape: the reinvention of intelligence agencies. The war had demonstrated the enormous value of espionage, code breaking, and covert operations, but the end of the war did not make these agencies obsolete. It simply redirected the purpose. The United States transitioned the Wartime Office of Strategic Services into what would eventually become the Central Intelligence Agency. But the CIA did not emerge as a peacetime organization focused on intelligence gathering. Instead, it was designed from the start to operate in the shadows, to carry out psychological warfare, covert interventions, and political manipulation. This was not a theoretical mandate. It was built on the logic of 1945, the recognition that the world was too interconnected, too unstable, and too competitive for nations to rely solely on diplomacy or military force. Direct confrontation between major powers risked catastrophic escalation, but covert action offered a flexible, deniable alternative. In the early years after 1945, the CIA expanded rapidly, absorbing former spies from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Many of these individuals had served regimes or factions that were morally problematic, but once again, their value was judged by their usefulness, not their pasts. This created a global network of operatives whose loyalties were fluid, whose methods were often ruthless, and whose actions were rarely visible to the public. This covert infrastructure played a critical role in shaping decolonization. As empires collapsed, newly independent nations became battlegrounds for influence between East and West. Both sides sought allies, but few governments openly declared their alignment. Instead, the competition played out behind the scenes. Intelligence agencies provided funding to political parties, supported coups, influenced elections, and armed factions willing to advance their interests. The most famous examples would emerge later: the CIA's involvement in Iran and Guatemala, the KGB's role in Eastern Europe. But the foundations of this global shadow war were laid in the immediate aftermath of 1945. The war had created a world where instability was abundant, governments were fragile, and populations were desperate. In this environment, covert power was one of the most effective tools of influence. The decisions made by foreign intelligence agencies in those early years often determined whether a country would lean towards capitalism or communism, democracy or dictatorship. These interventions created long-lasting consequences, many of which still reverberate in regions where mistrust of foreign powers runs deep. Another secret transformation of 1945 occurred in Asia, where the collapse of the Japanese Empire created a vacuum that rapidly filled with competing political visions. In Korea, the division of the peninsula was not the result of a grand strategic plan, but a hurried decision made in the chaotic final days of the war. American and Soviet officials hastily agreed on the 38th parallel as an administrative boundary, never intending it to become a permanent border. But events moved quickly, and both superpowers began shaping Korean politics to suit their interests. This improvised division hardened into two opposing states, each backed by a global power, setting the stage for a war that would erupt only 5 years later and define the geopolitics of East Asia for generations. The Korean War, often seen as the first major conflict of the Cold War, was the direct result of decisions made in the confusion of 1945. The people of Korea paid the price for a line drawn on a map by foreign officials who barely understood the region. In China, the end of the war accelerated the collapse of the fragile alliance between nationalists and communists. For years, these two factions had put aside their rivalry to resist Japanese invasion. But the moment Japan surrendered, the civil war resumed with renewed intensity. The United States supported the nationalists, while the Soviet Union indirectly assisted the communists by allowing them to capture Japanese weapons in Manchuria. This unequal distribution of resources would prove decisive. The Chinese Communist Party, strengthened by access to Japanese equipment and Soviet support, gained a critical advantage that ultimately reshaped global politics when it took power in 1949. The emergence of the People's Republic of China was not simply an internal revolution. It was a geopolitical earthquake whose roots lie in the strategic and often secret decisions made in 1945. The rise of modern China, its ideological trajectory, and its role in world affairs all connect back to the hidden consequences of that pivotal year. Across Southeast Asia, the collapse of the Japanese occupation created a vacuum that rapidly filled with competing political visions. In Vietnam, the most famous example, similar patterns unfolded in Indonesia, Burma, and Myanmar, and Malaysia. In many cases, Western powers underestimated the strength of nationalist movements, assuming they could quickly reassert control. They were wrong. The war had changed everything. Populations that had suffered under both Japanese occupation and European colonialism were emboldened, organized, and armed. The guerrilla tactics refined during the war were now turned against colonial armies. Western leaders, failing to grasp the depths of local resentment, viewed these movements through the narrow lens of communism, interpreting every uprising as a Soviet plot, rather than a struggle for autonomy. This misreading of local politics contributed to decades of conflict and intervention, shaping the global border in ways that still affect diplomacy, borders, and national identities in the region. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the end of the war brought new opportunities and new tensions. British and French influence was waning, and both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to expand their presence. The creation of Israel in 1948, while rooted in decades of Zionist aspirations and post-war realities, was also shaped by geopolitical calculations. The horrors of the Holocaust created widespread sympathy for Jewish refugees, but the strategic value of the region, particularly its oil reserves, added layers of complexity. Western support for Israel, Soviet maneuvers in neighboring states, and Arab nationalist movements all intersected in ways that made the region one of the most volatile in the post-war world. Many of today's Middle Eastern conflicts trace their origins not only to colonial boundaries drawn earlier in the century, but also to the hidden power struggles and diplomatic decisions that played out in the late 1940s.
The war may have ended in 1945, but its shadows stretched across the region, shaping alliances, rivalries, and territorial disputes that continue to influence global politics. Europe, too, was undergoing a transformation, hidden beneath the surface of reconstruction. The Marshall Plan, often celebrated as an act of American generosity, was also a strategic move to prevent the spread of communism. By stabilizing Western European economies, the United States aimed to create a bulwark against Soviet influence. But the plan also had an unspoken purpose: integrating Europe into a US-led economic system. This alignment would ensure access to markets, strengthen NATO, and create a unified front in the ideological battle of the coming decades. For the United States, helping Europe rebuild was not just about preventing another war. It was about shaping a world order in which American power remained central. For Europe, the plan created a path toward recovery, but it also meant accepting a degree of dependency, one that would influence European politics, trade, and foreign policy for generations. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union was pursuing its own strategy. Stalin understood that geography was his nation's greatest vulnerability. The USSR had been invaded multiple times from the West, and he was determined to create a buffer zone of friendly or controllable states. Through a combination of political pressure, military presence, and covert manipulation, the Soviet Union installed communist governments across the region. These governments justified their authority through narratives of liberation, but the truth was far more complex. Many Eastern Europeans resented Soviet control, leading to uprisings and resistance movements that were brutally suppressed. The Iron Curtain did not fall all at once. It descended gradually as each state was absorbed into the Soviet sphere. The decisions made behind closed doors in 1945, who controlled what territory, which leaders were acceptable, which borders were redrawn, set the stage for the division of Europe that would last nearly half a century. As the world adjusted to its new realities, the legacy of 1945 continued to evolve in ways that were invisible to most people, but fundamental to global dynamics. The war had ended, but the struggle for influence and the desire to control the future had only just begun. The geopolitical architecture built in those early years would define international relations, spark new conflicts, and shape the destiny of nations for decades. The hidden consequences of 1945 were not momentary disruptions, they were the foundation of the modern era. As the 20th century moved into its final decades, Japan found itself confronting a paradox that only deepened with time. The more the nation modernized, globalized, and distanced itself from the war, the more fiercely the struggle over its meaning intensified. Younger generations, raised in peace and prosperity, began to question why they must inherit guilt for events they never witnessed. Older generations, who lived through the war or its immediate aftermath, feared that forgetting was more dangerous than remembering. This generational shift added a new dimension to the history wars. It was no longer simply conservatives versus progressives, or nationalists versus internationalists. It became a conflict between memory fading and memory being reshaped, between lived experience and inherited narrative, between the emotional truth of survivors and the political ambitions of a new Japan trying to redefine itself on the world stage. Walking through Japan's museums reveals this battle in physical form. Some institutions embrace uncomfortable honesty, displaying testimonies from Nanjing, comfort women survivors, forced laborers, and the brutality of the Imperial Army. Others present a sanitized version, emphasizing Japanese suffering, the firebombing of cities, the atomic devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the hardships faced by civilians. One set of museums tells a story of perpetration, the other tells a story of victimhood. Both are true in their own ways, yet each exists in tension with the other. Visitors leave with different understandings depending on which building they walk into. Japan's memory landscape becomes a mosaic, fragmented, inconsistent, but revealing. It shows a nation still wrestling with itself, unsure where to place the moral weight of its past. Inside classrooms, the struggle is quieter but more consequential. Teachers are required to follow national curriculum guidelines, yet many resist, adding supplemental materials, testimonies, or independent lessons to balance what they feel the textbooks omit. Others follow the approved books closely, insisting that classroom time should not be a platform for political or moral debate. Students encounter everything from powerful first-hand accounts to carefully softened summaries written to avoid offense. The result is that two students, both raised in the same country, may walk away with profoundly different understandings of the war. And when these students become voters, policymakers, journalists, and educators themselves, their divergent perceptions carry forward the divisions their society never fully resolved. The internet intensified these divisions with a force no previous generation had experienced. Online communities became echo chambers that amplified nationalist rhetoric, revisionist arguments, and emotional reactions to foreign criticism. Forums and social media incubated denialist narratives staffed by anonymous users who could dismiss entire chapters of history with a single sentence. Meanwhile, progressive historians found themselves both empowered and drowned by the digital age. Empowered because research could reach millions, but drowned because misinformation spread faster than academic nuance. The digital era made history accessible, but also more manipulatable. It accelerated the fragmentation of memory, turning debates once confined to academic journals into public ideological battles fought at high volume and low accuracy. Outside Japan, the history wars also hardened international expectations. In China and South Korea, collective memories of Japanese occupation are foundational to national identity. These nations view any revisionist shift as a direct threat, a form of aggression in narrative form. A softened Japanese textbook is interpreted not as domestic policy, but as a diplomatic provocation. A visit by Japanese politicians to the Yasukuni shrine becomes not a symbolic gesture, but a sign of moral relapse. Books, museums, political statements, and even the vocabulary used in official speeches constrain diplomatic ties. Japan finds itself caught between internal pressures to reshape its narrative and external pressures demanding accountability for the version that already exists. History becomes geopolitics, and geopolitics becomes hostage to historical interpretation. What makes Japan's case unique is how the war still shadows its military posture today. Article 9 of the post-war constitution, the clause renouncing war, remains the heart of Japan's modern identity. Yet it is also a target of revisionists who argue that Japan must restore full military capability if it is to survive in a dangerous 21st century world. Their argument depends heavily on how the war is remembered. If the past is framed as a noble attempt to protect Asia from Western domination, then rearmament is revival. If the past is framed as aggression and tragedy, then rearmament appears reckless. Thus, the memory of the war directly influences Japan's security policy, shaping debates on everything from peacekeeping operations to the creation of a National Security Council. The rewriting of history is not merely symbolic, it resurrects old questions about power, militarism, and identity. Meanwhile, survivors, those whose voices once anchored the national conscience, are disappearing. Each year, fewer remain who can speak about the horrors of Unit 731, the occupation of Southeast Asia, the Manila Massacre, or the systematic exploitation of Korean and Chinese women. Their absence opens dangerous vacuums that can be filled with reinterpretation, minimization, or outright denial. The human emotional weight of the war, the trembling hands, the breaking voice, the lived memory, begins to fade. And into this silence steps politics, eager to redefine the past for strategic ends. Memory, once protected by the force of eyewitness testimony, now becomes vulnerable to ideological re-engineering. Within Japan itself, a growing movement of citizens has emerged who reject the binary framing entirely. They advocate for a narrative that admits suffering on all sides: Japanese civilians, forced laborers, colonized populations, prisoners of war, and Asian communities caught in the crossfire of a brutal conflict. This group argues that the war cannot be reduced to guilt, pride, shame, or heroism, that it must be understood as a human catastrophe shaped by imperialism, nationalism, ambition, and geopolitical momentum. They push for reconciliation not through denial or fixation, but through mutual recognition of trauma. Yet this layered, nuanced approach struggles to gain the same emotional traction as narratives rooted in victimhood or nationalism. Complexity rarely wins in political storytelling. The great irony of Japan's history wars is that the conflict is not really about the past, it is about the present. It is about national identity, regional security, global reputation, and the psychological distance between generations. It is about whether Japan sees itself primarily as a victim of the atomic bombings or as a former imperial power whose actions reshaped Asia. It is about whether the country will embrace a pacifist identity or reclaim a more assertive military role in a world defined by rising tensions. The battleground of memory becomes a mirror reflecting Japan's anxieties, aspirations, and unresolved questions about who it is and who it wants to be. By the time we enter the early 21st century, we become clear that the history wars are not calming, they are accelerating. Global media, political polarization, and the resurgence of nationalism worldwide ensure that the past remains an open wound. For Japan, every anniversary year, every new declassified document, every international dispute over memorials or statues reignites debates that have never fully healed. The war ended in 1945, but the struggle to define its meaning continues. Japan's narrative is not fixed. It is evolving, contested, and deeply intertwined with the future.
As the 21st century moves deeper into an era of geopolitical rivalry, technological fragmentation, and rising nationalism, the stakes of Japan's history wars grow larger, not smaller. What once seemed like an internal debate over textbooks, museums, and political speeches has evolved into something far more consequential: a struggle that shapes Asia's security environment, influences global perceptions of Japan, and affects how future generations understand the nature of war, responsibility, and reconciliation. The question is no longer only what happened in the past, but who controls the story, and how will that story determine Japan's role in the world ahead? The digital age transformed the battlefield yet again. History, once curated by scholars and institutions, is now shaped by algorithms, social media trends, and the viral spread of emotionally charged narratives. Revisionist arguments circulate through short video clips, anonymous posts, and political influencers who craft simplified stories to mobilize support. Conversely, new archival discoveries, survivor testimonies, and digital preservation projects give unprecedented access to documents once hidden or inaccessible. The result is a global flood of information, some accurate, some distorted, that amplifies the noise surrounding Japan's wartime past. History becomes a digital contest, where visibility often triumphs over accuracy. Meanwhile, foreign governments closely monitor Japan's narrative shifts, interpreting them through geopolitical lenses. China sees Japan's struggle over history as a tool, one that can be used to rally nationalism, justify military expansion, and strengthen domestic legitimacy. South Korea interprets Japan's memory politics through the unresolved pain of colonial occupation and the deeply personal trauma of comfort women. Western allies, particularly the United States, observe Japan's debates with a mixture of caution and interest, knowing that Japan's ability to step into a larger military role depends on its ability to reconcile its past with its neighbors. Thus, the future of Asia's balance of power is influenced not only by military budgets or strategic alliances, but by memorials, museums, and the narratives taught in Japanese schools.
Inside Japan, the younger generations increasingly view history through the prism of distance. They have no living memory of the war, and many feel disconnected from the emotional intensity that shaped their grandparents' generation. For them, the war is an abstract chapter in school books, overshadowed by modern concerns like economic stagnation, climate change, or technological transformation. This distance is both a blessing and a challenge. It opens the possibility for a more objective, less emotional engagement with the past, but it also risks the erosion of moral awareness, especially if political actors fill the vacuum with romanticized stories of heroism or sanitized narratives of national innocence. Japanese society today contains multiple parallel understandings of its wartime past, each with its own emotional logic. One group clings to pacifism, shaped by atomic devastation, firebombing, and the trauma of national collapse. Another embraces a more assertive nationalism, convinced that Japan has been unfairly constrained by a narrative imposed during the U.S. occupation. A third occupies the middle ground, desiring international respect and stability while cautiously navigating between accountability and national pride. These groups coexist, but their diverging perspectives make it increasingly difficult for Japan to articulate a single, unified narrative, especially on the global stage. The political arena amplifies these conflicts. Conservative leaders often use historical reinterpretation as a tool to rally support, framing revisionism as an act of national renewal. Progressive leaders counter with appeals to historical truth, regional reconciliation, and global responsibility. Each election cycle becomes a referendum not only on economic policy or foreign relations, but on memory itself. Speeches referencing the war are scrutinized word by word, their phrasing analyzed for signals of apology or defiance. Diplomatic statements, anniversary commemorations, and even the physical placement of memorial wreaths can spark controversy. The political cost of history remains high because memory itself has become a strategic asset. Beyond Japan's borders, the history wars feed into broader ideological narratives shaping the 21st century. As authoritarianism rises globally, some regimes use history as a weapon, emphasizing foreign aggression to justify internal control, or celebrating imperial pasts to legitimize territorial ambitions. In this environment, Japan's narrative choices influence how other nations interpret their own pasts. If Japan is perceived as whitewashing its wartime actions, it emboldens reactionary movements elsewhere. If Japan acknowledges the complexities of its past with honesty and nuance, it strengthens an international culture of accountability. In this way, Japan's history wars extend far beyond Asia. They become a test case for how modern societies confront difficult pasts in an age of polarized truth. Meanwhile, historians continue fighting a quieter, more patient battle. In archives across Japan, China, the United States, and Europe, researchers uncover new documents, personal diaries, military records, and diplomatic communications that shed new light on wartime events. These discoveries often complicate simplified narratives, revealing contradictions, nuances, and moral ambiguities that resist political appropriation. Yet historians face a challenge. Academic truth moves slowly, while political narratives move fast. What takes years to research can be overshadowed in hours by viral misinformation. And so, scholars become not just researchers, but defenders of evidence in a world that increasingly doubts the value of factual accuracy. One of the most profound challenges is the shrinking number of surviving eyewitnesses. Every year, more testimonies are lost, voices that once shaped Japan's collective conscience. Their absence creates both urgency and vulnerability. Museums race to digitize interviews, governments sponsor preservation projects, and grassroots organizations film survivors telling their stories. But digital memory is not the same as living memory. When survivors spoke, their presence carried emotional weight, moral authority, and human depth that no video clip can replicate. Their passing leaves history more exposed to reinterpretation or erasure. As the decades pass, the question arises, will Japan eventually reach a narrative equilibrium? Will there come a time when the history wars fade into the background, replaced by a broader consensus reflecting both national pride and moral responsibility? Or will memory remain contested indefinitely, shaped by every new geopolitical shift? The answer likely lies somewhere in the middle. What is emerging is not a single official narrative, but a pluralistic memory, one that acknowledges multiple perspectives without reducing history to national mythology. Young Japanese activists advocate for reconciliation with Korea and China, organizing cross-border dialogues and memorial visits. Teachers push for more comprehensive curricula despite political pushback. Scholars collaborate with international researchers to map the full historical landscape. At the same time, nationalist groups continue to resist what they see as unfair external criticism, arguing for a narrative that emphasizes Japan's suffering and achievements. These competing forces will shape Japan's memory into a complex, multi-layered identity rather than a monolithic story. In the broader global context, Japan's struggle with its wartime past mirrors a worldwide phenomenon. Nations re-evaluating their histories, uncovering suppressed traumas, and confronting legacies of colonialism, violence, and moral failure. The United States debates slavery, systemic injustice, and the mythology of its founding. European nations confront their colonial pasts. China navigates the contradictions of its revolutionary history. Russia manipulates historical memory to justify modern aggression. Japan is not alone. It is part of a global reckoning with history as a force that shapes identity, politics, and morality. The story of Japan's history wars is ultimately a story about truth and the power struggles that arise when truth becomes contested territory. It reveals how the past can shape military policy, diplomatic relations, national identity, and generational understanding. It demonstrates that history is never passive, it is an active force that must be tended, questioned, challenged, and preserved. And it reminds us that memory, once lost or distorted, is difficult to reclaim. In the end, the future of Japan's wartime narrative will depend on how the nation chooses to balance its desire for dignity with its responsibility to truth. It will depend on whether future generations listen to the fading voices of survivors, whether political leaders resist the temptation of revisionism, whether citizens demand accuracy rather than comfort, and whether Japan embraces the full complexity of its past rather than retreating into simplified stories. For now, the history wars continue, not out of malice, but because Japan stands at the intersection of memory and modernity, caught between the ghosts of 1945 and the uncertainties of the 21st century. The struggle is not merely about textbooks or monuments. It is about how a nation sees itself, how others see it, and how the past continues to shape the world we live in. And so Japan moves forward, carrying with it not a single narrative, but a contested legacy. A reminder that the past does not end, that memory does not fade without consequence, and that history, even when decades old, remains one of the most powerful forces shaping the present and the future.